Once Upon a Crime, Chapter 5. Gretel decided to wait for Hans in his room. Since finding him asleep in the hallway, she had persuaded him to allow her to look after his key, so was able to let herself in and get comfortable while she waited for him to return from the inn. She was so comfortable, in fact, that she slept soundly, not waking until the clock in the square struck midnight. She came to groggily, cursing Hans for keeping such hours. But this was late even for him. The thought crossed her mind that, once again, he might have keeled over before reaching his bed. Muttering oaths, she stepped into her shoes, secreted the knife about her person, and made her way out of the hotel in search of her brother. On the doorstep of the hotel, she collided with a small, stout fellow who she recognised as her travelling companion from a few days earlier. "Good evening, Herr Brackston," she said, in as normal a casual a voice as she could muster. The businessman stared at her, clearly at a loss. Gretel tried to help him out. "The stagecoach from Gerstenstadt?" Brackston nodded, seemingly reassured by this information. He muttered a greeting, glanced nervously over his shoulder, and scuttled inside. Gretel recalled the bombastic man who had bored everybody so loudly on their journey. He was barely recognisable as the anxious creature she had just encountered. No, she decided, not anxious, scared. Very scared, in fact. The night was clear and still but chilly, and she quickly regretted not pausing to fetch a warm cloak. The square was deserted, save for an elderly waiter taking in chairs from outside the coffee house. There was a good moon, and the glow from the windows of the buildings around the plaza threw down small patches of light. Gretel paced around the square, trying not to look furtive. A movement in one of the flower beds caught her eye. She went closer. The raised stone bed was thickly planted with spring bulbs, which were now waving and twitching, as if an army of moles were on the move beneath them. Stepping nearer, she found Hans flailing among the blooms. "Hans," she hissed at him, testing his level of inebriation. He did not answer. "Hans," she tried again. Hans' only reply was a tuneful fart. Gretel scanned the area. She and Hans were quite alone now. She pulled out the knife. Moonlight glinted on the blade. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. She reached down and took hold of Hans's flabby paw. She first arranged it this way, and then that, searching for the ideal position for chopping. It must be a clean cut. She found a large flat stone and slid it under the hand. Her breathing was ragged and irregular. She reminded herself why she was taking such drastic action. There was no other way to obtain the vital information she required to solve the case, and without a solution no further funds would be forthcoming from Frau Habsburg. And, what with the cost of staying at the spa, and the various bribes and expenses she had been forced to pay out, they were utterly skint. Hans had to understand drinking was an expensive pastime, and he did nothing whatsoever to bring any money into the household. She was doing what she had to do for both of them. She must act. She must. "Fraulein, good evening to you." The sound of Herr Peterson's voice forced a small scream from Gretel. Startled, she dropped the knife among the tulips. Straightening up to give what she prayed was a nonchalant and cheery wave. "Ah, Herr Peterson, Frau Peterson, lovely night, is it not?" "Indeed it is. Inge and I were just enjoying a stroll before turning in." "What a coincidence," Gretel laughed a little too loudly. "And my brother and I were doing the very same. Come along now, Hans. You'll get a much better look at the flowers in the morning." She heaved on the hand she had until seconds ago been planning to fillet. Hans snorted and opened his eyes. "Gretel, I was having such a pleasant nap, so comfortable." With her assistance he hauled himself to his feet. "Now I know why they're called flower beds," he chuckled. "Quite. One more lap of the square is in order, I think." She gave the Petersons a shrug and a what-can-you-do-with-them sort of smile. The couple nodded and smiled back. She wheeled Hans about and steered him onto the cobbles. "Come along now, Hans, a little more fresh air for you," she said as she struggled under his great weight, determined to put as much distance between herself, the knife, and her unwanted audience as she could. Her brother was a horribly unstable partner, so that they performed a lopsided waltz across the square, veering into a side alley. It took Gretel a full 15 minutes to get them back on course. Once she was certain the Petersons had gone, she pivoted Hans on his heel and aimed him at the hotel. There was no way she could let go of him to retrieve the knife. It would have to wait until morning. They made their lumbering progress up the stairs and at the last, both wheezing like old bellows, turned into the corridor that led to their rooms. Hans, who had until this point been fully occupied with the business of breathing and staying upright, suddenly found it in him to produce a nerve-shredding shriek. Gretel followed the direction of the trembling hand he extended before him. There, slumped against the wall, beneath a picture of 2 Grecian maids and an oversized urn, was Herr Beckstein. His staring eyes were devoid of life, his pale skin indicating severe desanguination, and sunk deep into his chest an expensive, bone-handled hunting knife. The painfully hard wooden bench that passed for seating in the front of the wool wagon made Gretel think wistfully of the stagecoach. Every stone, every rut, every hole jolted and jarred her until she feared permanent damage might be done. Hans had opted for a recumbent position in the back and was dozing happily among the wool sacks. She had been thankful no one was about to witness their undignified departure, so early was the hour. After a gruelling interview with 3 zealous kingsmen, followed by a restless hour in her bed, she had decided they should leave at first light. A waiter had been employed to find someone heading in the right direction, and Gretel had parted with yet more money to secure 2 seats to Gerstenstadt on the rickety cart. The first 2 hours, staring at the rear ends of 2 flatulent mules, had been a trial. The remainder of the journey had at least been improved by the addition of the wool merchant's wife, who joined them farther down the valley, and brought with her plentiful supplies of fresh bread, wurst, and cheeses. Gretel snacked glumly and tried to organise events and their possible consequences in her head. Beckstein was very, very dead, and the very knife that killed him had been her very own. These facts had been enough to bring an excited flush to the cheeks of the kingsman charged with the task of investigating the case, and only Gretel's ability to wear people down with her self-assurance and quick wits had prevented him from charging both her and Hans with murder. While the weapon was indeed damning evidence, the opportunity was arguable. The kingsman lacked the vital element of motive. He had reluctantly accepted that he had no grounds on which to hold his prime suspects, and had not had the sense to obtain an order preventing them from leaving the hotel. Gretel knew it could only be a matter of time before he rectified this error, hence her keenness to quit Bad am See. And they did so by the first conveyance that presented itself. She was at a loss as to why anyone should actually bother to kill the bumptious businessman. True, he had been irritating, but so were a lot of people, and unfair as it might seem, this was not good enough reason to do them in. He must have done something to seriously upset someone, and whoever that someone was, they had got hold of Gretel's knife and used it. But who? The square had been empty that night, save for the Petersons, neither of whom Gretel could see as murderers. And why had Beckstein been, apparently, heading for her room? How could it be that a law-abiding subject such as herself should have been accused of capital offences twice in as many weeks? And where, in the name of all that was sensible, was she now going to find a finger? On top of which, the very last coin and note had been spent, and as yet she had no real progress to take to Frau Habsburg. Still, Gretel reasoned she could legitimately claim for some of the expenses she had incurred. Perhaps the silly woman would appreciate her efforts. After all, she had visited the old crone, escaped from a dungeon, wrestled a lion, travelled several leagues distance, dealt with an amorous troll, and become a fugitive from justice. Surely all that meant she was due some sort of recompense. She had the wool merchant drop her off at Kirschbaum Avenue. Matters in the form of Gretel's finances were urgent. Frau Habsburg would just have to take her as she was, the dust of the journey still upon her. She found her client busy tending roses in her front garden, and felt her spirits lift at the thought that she might be able to conduct the entire interview outside and not have to enter the cat-ridden, flea-infested house itself. She let herself through the picket gate and made her way along the narrow stone path. Slinky shapes darted in front of her, or slipped among the shrubbery as she went. Here and there a cat basked in the sunshine of the fading day. Further felines lay in window boxes or on the iron bench across the lawn. "Good afternoon to you, Frau Habsburg," she called out. "Oh, Fraulein Gretel, are they found? My poor tiny ones, have you recovered them?" She sprang to her feet, trowel held high, a look of hope on her face so heartbreaking even Gretel felt its impact. Alas, not yet, but she hurried on, anxious to prevent one of the bouts of weeping the elderly woman seemed so prone to. I have news. We must take heart, Frau Habsburg. You know who has them? Not exactly. But you know where they are? Not precisely. Then you have at least heard that they are safe. Not specifically. The poor woman wobbled, lowering her trowel, her eyes brimming. In that case, I fail to see, she said, how any news you may have could be of significance. Gretel stepped forward, eager to give reassurance. But as she was separated from Frau Habsburg by a particularly floriferous specimen of Himalayan tea rose, she had to deliver her speech through a screen of leaves and blooms. I have made an excellent contact. She quelled a shudder at the memory of the troll and prayed she would not be questioned in detail about her source. He lives near the resort of Bad am See. He has, it transpires, some important local knowledge on the matter, and he is willing, for a price, to reveal the name of the person who has taken not just your cats, but others besides. Others have been stolen? There are more poor folk who suffer as I do. What monstrous fiend would be so cruel, would inflict such suffering? The eyes were still filled with tears, but none fell. Gretel felt she was winning, so pressed on. Indeed, but do not distress yourself unnecessarily. I have given the situation a great deal of my time and attention, she said pointedly. I have mulled over the specifics and cogitated upon the facts. And what strikes me is this. A person, however wrong, however misguided in his actions, a person who will go to great expense and effort to acquire something, must surely do so because it is of value to him, because he covets that thing, and once in his possession will treasure it and treat it with the utmost kindness and care. That's what I think. Yes, Frau Habsburg nodded uncertainly, her head bobbing up and down like a bluebell in a breeze. It would seem to signify. It may be that my little darlings are lost to me for now, but at least they have come to no harm, but are loved and looked after well. Oh, Fraulein, do you truly believe that to be the case? I am certain of it, said Gretel, crossing her fingers behind her back. The truth was, her informant had given her no hint of the purpose behind the catnapper's actions. She thought it best not to share the unasked-for insight she had gained into the feeding habits of trolls regarding small domestic animals. She studied the furry pets surrounding her, and while she felt no desire to touch the things, she found she didn't care for the idea of them being eaten. This puzzled her a little. Was there a danger she was growing accustomed to the creatures after all? She attempted to hold the gaze of a coal-black Tom sitting beneath a laburnum. No, it was no good, she concluded. Stare at a cat long enough and you start to think of witches. She cleared her throat. Naturally, I have formulated a plan, she said. You have? A complex and thorough course of action that will, I can confidently state, bring about the results we desire. Oh, I do so hope you are right. I remain in fear that all my little darlings are in danger. I hardly dare let them out of my sight. Rest assured, Frau Habsburg, excellent progress in the case is being made. Of course, such dedication has already made considerable demands on my time and resources, and will continue to do so. She waited. Her client looked blank. Gretel went on. Expenses are rising daily, and I anticipate them doubling very soon. Still no response. I will shortly have to make another trip to Bad am See, and indeed travel further to follow up the promising leads I have already unearthed, to see what I can see. One or two of the cats had clearly decided it was tea time and begun to wind themselves around any legs they could find, starting up a wailing and singing that set Gretel's teeth on edge. It was all the provocation she needed to cut to the chase. I will need a deal more money to enable me to continue my investigations, she declared. Oh, but of course, Frau Habsburg all but dropped her trowel. Forgive me for not raising the matter myself. How much will you require? Gretel thought of a number, doubled it, added a smidge more for discomfort and personal humiliation already suffered, toyed with the idea of listing all the expenses accrued thus far, tossed the idea aside as too much effort, added a further sum for unseen circumstances that might very well arise, and delivered the figure in confident tones. Her client scurried off without a word of complaint or resistance, making Gretel wish she'd asked for more, returning mere minutes later with a fat bundle of notes. As Gretel headed for home, she found her travel weariness considerably alleviated by the comforting bolster of money now nestled snugly in her corset. She was looking forward to the gentle pleasures of home, Hans's cooking, her daybed, an uplifting martini or two. The twilight was settling prettily on Gerstenstadt, and in her current mood even she found it appealing. She turned out of Kirschbaum Avenue, her stomach growling in anticipation of one of Hans's feasts, and was just about drawing level with the still smouldering Cartwright's workshop when she saw a young couple standing among the remnants of the buildings. Something in the tone of their exchange caused her to pause. She knew the young man to be Roland, the elder of Hund's sons, and squinting through the dwindling light, she recognized Johanna, the new girl from Madame Renoir's parlour. It still bothered Gretel that she could not place the girl. Secreting herself behind a handy lilac bush, her detective antennae twitching, she tuned in to their conversation.